Welcome to today's panel, Witnessing Land, Witnessing Possession. Today we are joined by four panelists, Allison Guess, Brittany Mache, Robin McDowell, and Priscilla McCutcheon. Dr. Allison Guess is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Williams College. In 2021, Guess was a CUNY Dominican Studies Institute Research Fellow in Harlem, New York. She earned a PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences, or Human Geography, at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Named a Rising Latino Studies Scholar in 2020, Guess is a former inter-university program for Latino Research Fellow funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Her published scholarly work can be found in Women's Studies Quarterly, Feminist Formation, which is under revision, the Journal of Early American History, which is also under revision, Deterritorializing/Reterritorializing, Critical Geography of Educational Reform, American Quarterly, Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education and Society, and Departures in Critical Qualitative Research. Dr. Brittany Mache is a multidisciplinary scholar working across the fields of environmental studies, security studies, African diaspora studies, and science and technology studies. She currently serves as Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies and affiliated faculty in Science and Technology Studies at Williams College. Brittany earned her PhD in Geography from the University of California, Berkeley. Her research examines the politics of environmental expertise, global security projects, French and United States Empire, and the making of Black African diasporic worlds. Brittany's work has been featured in Antipode, Society in Space, ACME, Environment and Society, and in the edited volume of a research agenda for military geographies. Brittany previously served as the Jais Bolin Postdoctoral Fellow at Williams College and the Macmillan Stewart Residential Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. She is completing a book manuscript about security interventions, climate change, and the afterlives of empire in the West African Sahel. Dr. Robin McDowell is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Her interdisciplinary research explores environmental racism and injustice in Louisiana. Her book project, Swamp Capitalism, The Roots of Environmental Racism, is a history of bonds between blackness, ecology, and labor on a geologic timescale. Her research explores historical dimensions of environmental racism and visions for environmental justice for Black communities. Through narratives of South Louisiana wetlands, sugar plantations, oil fields, and salt mines, her work demonstrates how racial, environmental, and economic encounters in these spaces created conditions of Black life that shaped and continue to shape the foundations of North America. Dr. Priscilla McCutcheon is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Geography and associate director of the African American and Africana Studies Institute. She completed her MA and PhD at the University of Georgia and her BA with honors at Spelman College. Much of her work has been with Black faith-based food programs and sustainable farms in the U.S. South. She recently completed a project on the National Council of Negro Women, a historic Black middle and upper middle class organization that had a widespread hunger and health campaign during the civil rights and Black power movement. She is increasingly interested in Black spiritual and religious geographies and the ways in which the spirit is used to conceptualize space and place, particularly in the U.S. South. This includes a project on deathscapes that centers a Black cemetery in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Dr. McCutcheon is currently working on a project with Black church food workers in South Carolina where they categorize their important but often overlooked work as food justice activism. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for today's panel: the Geosciences Department, the Africana Studies Department, the Class of '63 Scholars Fund, and the W. Ford Schuman 50 Program in Democratic Studies. Finally, I'd like to share the format of today's panel. Rather than each panelist offering prepared remarks, a conversation will emerge from prepared questions the panelists have and will pose to the other panel members. With that said, let's begin. Dr. Guess, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you very much, Shannon. I really appreciate that beautiful introduction. Welcome you all. As Shannon explained to you all, we prepared a series of questions that we'd like to ask one another. So I guess I'll start it off. I guess a question that I have for you all is what brings you to this work? I think all of us have work in common as it pertains to land, liberation, and sovereignty. And I'm just curious, what kind of brought you to this work? Anyone can start.
Maybe I'll start, and I think There are a number of things that bring me to the work that brought me to this space, but I think given the format, I would like to share something specifically from my undergraduate experience that brought me to this work. So when I started my undergrad at NYU, I had a kind of list of things that I thought I was going to do with my life. I thought I was going to law school. I had this plan, and the plan kind of exploded after a transformative study abroad experience. I had the opportunity to study abroad in Accra, Ghana in West Africa. This was in late 2008. So I got to watch the Obama election happen from the African continent. And it forced me to grapple with a number of questions that I am still asking in my work, which is, one, why does global inequity, global poverty persist? Two, how can we build transnational solidarity and connections with people who may seem another world away? And then three, how are the materials, the resources that constitute this world extracted and used in ways that further inequities? So I remember walking into my class at the University of Legon in Ghana and a Ghanaian professor telling all of us eager students from the United States with our fancy laptops, where do you think the materials came from to make your laptop, right? And that opening a conversation about resource extraction on the continent and how we are implicated in these webs of both extraction, but also connection, ways of writing, ways of thinking. And so those are some of the questions that I'm still attempting to grapple with. I still do work on the African continent, primarily in West Africa, and I'm still attempting to sort of grapple with what it might mean to act more ethically in this world.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And some of the things you were saying were also resonating with me, in particular, kind of this idea of embodied knowledge and this experience that's bringing you to it, not just from reading about it, or not just having it relayed to you by someone else, but living somewhere as events are unfolding that we do not yet even have the tools to analyze, perhaps, and then that's where the study and research comes in much later. And so I came to my work actually through living in New Orleans. Moving down there in the still kind of militarized post-Katrina landscape and getting to know that city not as the kind of tourist marketing would have you understand, but a city that was kind of trying to, I don't want to say rebuild because it was always there, but a city going through profound and tragic changes. While also kind of exploring Louisiana outside of New Orleans. And in that capacity, I started working as have you ever taken a ghost tour in the French Quarter? That was my job. So it's very tourism-based, hospitality-based industry, and you kind of have to piece together a lot of different jobs in the tourism service industry. So that was one of my jobs, of giving those spooky tours. And part of that was that we had to be trained on a script that you basically had to memorize, which I was finding as I was getting more involved in political organizing in and out of the city, that this was ridiculous. Why am I reciting these, frankly, whitewash histories, incorrect histories, histories that are leaving out the history of enslaved African and African American people in New Orleans? So I kind of went rogue and started doing my own research, and going off script and bringing this into organizing work in New Orleans and outside in the rural parishes. And I guess the rest is history of making history and continuing to make it.
Want me to go? Yeah. Sure. And so I think a lot of who I am as a scholar goes back to my upbringing. And I think a lot of it came into focus during my freshman year at Spelman. And so I don't think that they use a fancy algorithm, but we were on these small halls. And it seems like all of us on our hall were from the rural South. And so I'm from a really small town, Denmark, South Carolina. Also, I think we're related, Denmark, South Carolina, which you'll probably hear more about later. And so there was someone on my hall from Oxford, Mississippi, also a small town outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And Spelman's interesting because we all identify as Black women, but in terms of diversity, it was one of the most diverse experiences in terms of geographic diversity and also economic diversity that I've ever been in my entire life. And so one of the things that we had in common on my hall was that we all had families who grew something, and so they all had gardens, they all had farms, and they were also involved in Black religious spaces in some way. And so in that way, I think we connected in many ways, and I think kind of moving into my work, particularly in the rural South, that never really left me. And so for me, when my work is at its best, I'm engaging with who I am as a scholar and my upbringing in many ways. And so a lot of it is in the rural South, particularly rural parts of South Carolina.
I guess I can also, contribute to that question since I asked it. So yeah, I grew up in a family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father is also from Denmark, South Carolina, which is interesting. We just found this out yesterday. She actually grew up on the street that my grandmother lives at. So it's really odd. I mean, everyone in this very small, all-Black rural town are kin to one another. So it's very interesting that Denmark produced 2 Black women geographers, and I just think it's super interesting to think about this in this time, and that years later we would be sitting on this panel together. So I'm so happy to be here with all of my sisters, but yeah. So I grew up in a family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on the border of one of the most notorious Black neighborhoods that was laden with crime, you know, like that typical narrative that you all are probably very overhearing so much. So I grew up at that border, at that intersection, already on the edge. My father coming from the rural South, my mother from Pittsburgh, but having, rural South Carolinian roots as well. But our family was very poor, so we gardened a lot. So we literally did that because that was the way that my parents helped to piece together meals for us and to make ends meet. But it was very strange because we were doing that before it was really cool and widely accepted. There was no urban agriculture. There was no farm to table. We were doing that before that. I always like to tell this story at the time. Our neighbor next door was an elder white woman, and my brother and I, at like 2 and 3 years old, would go over and give her zucchini, and she would like slip Kit Kat bars under the fence for us. And that was like our exchange, and we thought we were getting the gold, but realizing now we were getting the gold. So that's kind of how I grew up. I was like doing gardening work before I could even walk. And with 3 generations going back to my great-grandmother. So that's kind of how I grew up. I didn't even particularly enjoy it at that time. I was kind of dramatic. I thought that it was like my parents were subjecting me to conditions that my ancestors had dealt with, which was quite blown out of proportion and of course a false equivalent. So that's how I grew up, and when I went to college, I also thought that I would be doing work in policy and politics. I thought I would become a diplomat, and I studied abroad 3 times in undergrad. So I was always away, I was always out, and I think during that time something about land really stood out to me. Like, I wanted to know what were the ways in which land was always central to Black people's disenfranchisement. So after that point, I started to investigate this question. I first started to think about South Carolinian communities as well as communities and Quilombola communities in Brazil. And then those questions continued and expanded, and ultimately I ended up applying to a geography program. I never thought I would do a PhD. I never intended on it. I wasn't primed and prepped for it. But here I am today. And it's been one of the most rewarding journeys that I could really ever think that I would encounter.
And so can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Because a lot of us started with plans to do one thing and change. And so what changed? Or what prompted the change?
Yeah. I like this question because I often have discussions with students in my class, and they say, well, what should I do for the next semester? Or where should I go abroad? Or what internship should I take? Or what job, what grad school should I be applying to? And I think if you ask so many people, both the people that I look up to, but so many of the faculty on this campus, there's a sense that there are paths that you can't even see yet, right? And they kind of materialize. And that kind of serendipity is something that I have come to appreciate both about my own career, my own trajectory, but also when I talk to my own mentors, they say, I never thought I would end up, being a professor at Princeton because I grew up on a farm in California, right? And there were so many sort of routes that I took from that farm to Princeton, right? And it doesn't have to be this kind of script that you follow, but that you can be open to the directions that your life might take you in, but also being open to new kinds of questions that demand new ways of thinking. And I think for me, especially deciding not to go to law school, there was a sense that sort of legal thinking couldn't answer some of the questions that I was starting to ask, both myself, but also about the world. Which is not to say that there aren't a number of questions that legal thinking can answer, but I think for me it was asking new kinds of questions and asking people where might I begin to sort of find answers for those questions. And mentors saying, hey, have you heard of this thing called geography, right? I had never heard of this field, and people said, well, if you're interested in politics and land and the politics of space and environmental knowledge, there's a whole field where people are doing that, so maybe move in that direction. So I just like to think of my interrupted plans as a kind of serendipitous moment, and I would hope that my students and the students who are in here might not be afraid to kind of open themselves up to some of those moments of serendipity.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you so much for the follow-up and for sharing that as well. And serendipity, oh my gosh. So I guess, yeah, if I can share, I am a engineering school dropout. Chemical and biomolecular engineering, and then switched my major to fine art and printmaking. And then I worked in advertising, and then I worked in the hospitality industry, and then wanted to do public history, and then political all of this stuff, right, kind of comes together. And I was always searching for the place to live out, enact my commitments and values to myself and in public and to my community. And so then that has taken so many different forms that it's almost like the form followed the function, but yet it comes full circle, because here I am doing race and ecology, Louisiana, so I'm drawing on some of those those DNA diagrams from 2000. So, yeah, so circuitous, but
yeah, I can definitely relate to the idea of it coming full circle. For one, starting out as like a small toddler, like winding through tomato vines and trying not to trip myself as I'm also learning to walk, and then coming back to the question of land later in life. And then also in my undergraduate, I did a double major. I majored in political science and Hispanic languages and literature. And I didn't know that when I was reading 16th century accounts, like reading Don Quixote in undergrad, that later in life I would be studying the first Black rebellion of the New World that also takes place in La Hispaniola in the same time period. So I actually thought that I wouldn't be thinking through Black geographies in the region. But I ended up coming back to that. And I think like sometimes in those moments where things change, or that full circle coming into circulation, it feels like there's a resistance. Sometimes it's there. You almost feel like you don't want to go down that path. When I decided that I would be shifting from thinking about policy work and politics and then going back to land, I was in my last year as an undergraduate student, and I felt like I was in a state of crisis. And I literally had one semester left, and from that point, I was lucky to have mentors that trusted the intuition that I found myself navigating, and also help to like foster it. So I think like it's not a singular process, like you need people in community to make that happen. Yeah, it has to be nurtured.
Do I have to answer my own?
No.
I think for me, it came from like a few places. And so there was honesty on the part of my professors. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. My constitutional law professor, because I got an A in her class, and so I was like, nobody gets an A. So clearly she's going to write my law school recommendations. And she's like, you should not be an attorney because you ask too many follow-up questions. Like, I wanted to know like the root of the law, and she's like, you should be a professor. And I was like, well, no, I really want to be a lawyer. And so I wanted to be an environmental justice attorney. I did an internship at the EPA. I hated it. And so I kind of knew that that wasn't a step that I wanted to go in. And I think in some ways, like background, I was lucky. My mother is a researcher, a research professor. In terms of flexibility, she had me and my sister while she was in graduate school. And so I knew that there was a level of flexibility. And I know that this comes with other jobs, but that I wanted in my life as I got older. There were questions that I wanted to ask. I like being in school, and there's something about being a professor that I feel like I'm also a student at the same time, so I'm constantly learning from my students and asking questions. And so I'm a lifelong learner, and it's a career that I can be happy in. And so for me, that was where the switch came in. And some of it, like, to be honest, was I'm debt averse, and so I was a little worried when I started looking at like the cost of law school. It's like, I don't know about this, and I started thinking about like grad school stipends and stuff, and it ended up being a better option for me. And so for me, it worked out, but you know, I think people make different decisions for different reasons.
Yeah.
Maybe I won't ask our second prepared question since Allison and I just switched places. Yeah. So our second prepared question is, what kinds of intellectual heritages have been most meaningful to you on this path that you've taken?
I guess I can start off. I mean, I think what has really inspired me is a lot of the wisdom that I got from personal ancestors. And it's really taken me so far in life on my individual journey, but also in the intellectual. So I think like that's one heritage that I really see myself grounded in, but also thinking through fugitivity and the Black radical tradition and Black feminist traditions are also central to my work or the way in which I go about living life or teaching. So I think these are things that I kind of lean on. I'm also leaning on people who get less notice in history and in geography. I'm really inspired by Denmark Vesey. This is an ancestor that I call on. When I'm in classes with my students, I pour libations. I think it's important that we collectively remember our ancestors. And so the state of conjure is something that's always central to my practice. And yeah, I think it just carries us through.
I think for me, I guess I would follow like a lot of it is from people that came before me, and so personal experience, families, and particularly studying food and sustainable agriculture. I remind myself often that a lot of the things that I'm studying are not new, and so a lot of like local food, organic food has been done before. It just maybe wasn't using that name, and so I use my grandfather as an example when I did interviews with him about like his experiences with farming, and I'm using terminology around sustainable agriculture and organic food. Finally, he's like, you just mean farming without chemicals. And I'm like, and he's like, you're in school to study this, right? And so, I mean, and so just thinking about like how people understand these movements before there's a fancy name to it, attached to it, and also giving credit, as you said, to these movements. Another thing I'll say is that there's a critical mass of people. I don't know if there's a critical mass, but there are more people now in geography who study Black geographies. And so when I was applying for jobs, coming out of graduate school, I couldn't say that I was studying Black geographies. I said that I was studying race and geography. But now there are people studying Black geographies as a way to understand space that kind of goes outside of normative traditions. One of the things that I think that's helpful for me in the geographic context that I teach in, because I'm in Appalachia, is that by recognizing that I'm from a rural area myself, my students in many ways have never had a black professor. They probably never had a black teacher. They probably never lived beside a black person. But when I talk about my experiences in rural spaces, they can relate to that. And so I think that helps in terms of bringing my intellectual tradition into the classroom and explaining how we can think about space kind of outside of these normative ways.
Thank you all. And I suppose when you think of that question, right, of what intellectual traditions are you working out of, the first thing you want to do is kind of list a bibliography, right? But I think that's so important about what connects us all as well, is that our very first and most important response to that question is not a kind of bibliography, a Chicago-style bibliography, right? It is a kind of, bibliography of the heart and mind and soul. And I think of my work as following in perhaps a tradition of stewardship, of understanding that not only does our earth, soil, air, water not belong to us, but that there are stories that don't belong to us as well. And how are you the most caring and responsible steward of knowledge and resources? And what is your role of people who have been involved in movement work, agricultural work, in the work of creating Black studies departments around the world? What are they passing on to us? What are they passing on to me to steward, nurture, pass on? So I think of it in that way, that I'm just kind of taking a gift.
Yeah, I want to kind of echo what everyone has said, and sort of problematizing what even counts as intellectual work, right? So thinking about sort of ancestors or family or traditions. But since there are a couple of my students in this room and I make them read incredibly hard things, I do want to at least give a little bit of
All right, let's bibliography.
Well, because I think there is an important aspect of learning, which is encountering texts that can be incredibly frustrating or unfamiliar, or that take time to work through. And I think that has also been a part of my intellectual heritage. Like sitting down and working with dense political theory and trying to make heads or tails of it. Or maybe thinking critically about what the term nature means and having to read all sorts of deep philosophical renderings about what nature meant in the 18th century versus what it means in the 21st century. So I think even as there's a kind of embodied challenge to what counts as intellectualism, I think there's also a way that sort of grappling with some of those kind of deep intellectual texts has actually forced me to rethink how I embody both myself, right, as a kind of scholar, as a researcher, but also how I want to think about the world in more complex ways. So there's a reason I assign all of the difficult things, is what I'm saying to my students in the room.
It's not an either or, it's both
and.
It's
Both and, yeah.
Wait, I'm curious, actually, was there a game-changing text for you that you read and it just...
So there's one that I continue to read, because going back to what you were saying, I read it over and over and over and I get something new every time. And so Black Geographies and the Politics of Place by Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods is an edited volume. And also, two, you asked for one, but two, but also Demonic Grounds by Catherine McKittrick. It's incredibly dense. And anytime that students tell me oh, I read it and I got it the first time, and it's I've read it 20 times and I'm still getting something new every time. But it's, in terms of vantage points and kind of getting outside of, again, these normative understandings of space and place and understanding exactly what Black Geographies is, those are the texts that really kind of do it for me. There are others that kind of come around those or behind those, but those are the ones that really kind of force me to re-examine what I'm doing as a scholar. And they also pushed me and like pushed my theory, I think, a lot further.
I don't know if there was a game-changing text for me. I think for me it was more about game-changing moments, which I guess we can also think of as texts. When I was studying abroad as an undergraduate student, like I said, I went abroad 3 times, but one of those times was spent in Cuba, and at the time that I was there, it was not only the election in which Barack Obama was incoming president of the U.S., but it was also the 50th anniversary of the agrarian reform. And so that was really central to me thinking more about land, and also why it was so much a part of like my life as a person on this planet in this time, but also why it was so central to so many other people's liberation. So yeah, I think that that's kind of what was a game changer for me.
Oh, I also have 2. Clyde Woods, Development, Drowned and Reborn, in terms of plantation geographies, really got me looking at Louisiana like I never had before. And then the other was actually a book written by written and independently published by one of my mentors, who is a descendant of one of the rebels of the 1811 slave revolt in Louisiana. And it was this awesome compendium of like 30 years of his research on his family and lineage, but also secondary texts, also archives in Tulane and the U.S. Mint and everything, and was just this. It's this model for writing rigorous historical research on uprising and genealogy. So for me, that was.
Yeah. I feel like it's always hard. So I'll say the text I was introduced to as an undergrad that I feel like changed so much was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And I think it was just because there was an audacity to the text, like, oh, like you could write something that's like actively polemical and like actively, like you can do something with writing that's supposed to kind of galvanize, right? There was something about the kind of tone of the book that read so urgent, and the kind of history of the text, you know, he is dying, and sort of thinking about just the ways that writing could literally jump off of the page and feel like it was ready to change the stakes of the world. I think that always sticks with me. But then it's also like whatever I just finished reading, right? So I'm teaching Susan Sontag on Monday, and I'm super excited to return to Susan Sontag's work, right? And so there's a way that it's both sort of things that have stayed with me, but it's always the kind of the next thing that I'm sort of teaching, the next thing that I'm reading, so.
I just taught Wretched of the Earth last week.
Look at that!
Do you want to ask the next question?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so I will go up with our next question, which was, it's kind of been touched upon, but this is kind of to go a little deeper, is for our research and the work that we're doing, what are some of the broader implications of it and possible or current applications?
Me? So one project, and I would have to, I'm still thinking through the broader implications, but one project that I'm working on is on Black deathscapes, and so I'm looking at cemeteries, particularly in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And the way that that project came to be was just, again, family, and so thinking about death in the context of the pandemic, also social uprisings, but also my father, and so I mentioned my mother, my dad's a minister, and one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that he was busier for multiple reasons more than ever, and a lot of the burials that he was doing, they were outside, and so I started to think a lot about land use, but particularly Black cemeteries is like segregated spaces, particularly in the South, and so people not having ideal land to live on during life, but also not being buried on in death. And so the cemetery that I'm looking at in Orangeburg in particular is one that is interesting because it has a lot of historic figures, black figures that are buried there, but a lot of people don't really know about. And so I guess in terms of implications, I'm thinking about kind of cemeteries as living spaces, and it's something that we're talking about more. Like I'm hearing more of my students talk about death in really morbid ways, and this is turning into a morbid discussion in really morbid ways more than ever. But I think people are also just starting to think about life and kind of what happens after death more than ever. And so those are some of the implications, I guess, for that work. And then the food work is always just kind of thinking about how we can understand what people are doing in Black Protestant churches as food justice activism, because a lot of the work that's occurring in Black churches, including the membership, is comprised of Black women. But when we think about who gets a lot of the attention, it's usually the person who is preaching from the pulpit on Sunday morning, oftentimes Black male preachers. And so what about the food service work that's being done in these churches, and how can we understand that as food justice activism, which I think has implications, particularly in the context of a movement that looks at food justice in very limited ways. So it often looks at it as urban gardening, community gardening. You have to put the word justice beside it, but what about just a church person who's serving food? Like, is that food justice activism? So I'm just kind of reimagining that, or not reimagining, but rethinking that in my work.
Yeah, I think like applications and implications, I mean, like my work centers on the question and the notion of Black land in the Atlantic world. The research that I'm doing or currently involved in is like 15th and 16th century, so it's about 500 years ago plus. What's interesting to me is that a lot of what we see in this early time period is very similar to what we see happening and manifesting now. I wrote my dissertation, during the 2020 Black and Indigenous rebellions and uprising, as I was actively writing about a Black and Indigenous rebellion and uprising on the island of La Hispaniola. And I think that it's also the same time period where the first endemic on this part of the world takes place, smallpox, and then I'm also living in a time of COVID. So it was very synergistic for me when I thought about that compression of time and space that was lived, right? And I think like as far as like the applications of the work, well, I mean, as a geographer, I'm always thinking about space, right? So I like to take my students outside of the physical classroom space, because I think not only does knowledge production happen elsewhere sometimes, right? It's not just in the ivory tower that we learn about things and we think about how knowledge is formed, but it also can take shape through our active activity, right? So one thing like I've been thinking about, I asked my students in class this year to vlog about a Black space in either the larger Berkshires or on campus, and many students use that as an opportunity to really grieve out their frustrations about what it means to be Black in a place like this. And I often allow my students to grieve, right? A lot of our discussions are about that process. It's about, the experiences they had, the interactions that they had, frustrations that many of them share. But I think what's important is to think about how we can mobilize those feelings, right? Mobilize them into the political, right? And so, for example, a lot of my students have been really upset with the question of housing, where they live, not having furniture, and one of the only Black spaces that there are on this campus. And I said, spontaneously to my students just this week, like, okay, so then why don't we actually actively make that space? Like, why don't we actually make that place? Like, collectively, we can do something with it, right? So that you guys can have a sense of home. And I encourage them, let's make some vision boards. Let's make a Pinterest page. Let's put out a wish list and see what it is that you all desire, because I think desire also has to come into the political as well. So I've been thinking more about, what it means to enact, applied Black geography, right? So yeah.
you want to go since I asked it?
Yeah. I will say that the question about application is a somewhat sore spot for me. When I initially started my PhD, I was adamant that I was not going to become a professor. One of my sort of mentors when I had worked at the State Department gave me the old adage, those that can do, those that can't teach. Ooh. And so there was this sense of like, no, I'm going to do active sort of policy work. And I decided to teach for all kinds of reasons. I love it. It's enjoyable. But I do often ask myself, okay, what would it mean to still have a kind of foot in that world? And I've tried to carve that out in a number of ways. So I've worked with international NGOs, I've worked with the UN agency, I work with a progressive think tank based in DC. We were just meeting with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee over the summer, right? So trying to sort of keep that applied work at the forefront of my research. I also think of writing and publishing as a form of applied work, but then ultimately teaching is applied work, right? There's a way that I'm thrilled when I hear from former students who are going to law school to become environmental justice lawyers. I'm thrilled when somebody who decides to be a K through 12 teacher tells me, hey, that reading that we did, I'm thinking about changing a lesson plan so we incorporate more of that history of the African continent, which oftentimes isn't taught in K through 12 history curricula, right? There are ways that the kind of multiplicity of the jobs and careers that students who I've worked with, both here at Williams, but previously when I taught at Berkeley as a grad student, they are going off into the world to do things, to make things. And I would like to claim just a little piece of that as a kind of educator or as a mentor. And so I think I've come to reconsider what it means to be sitting at a place like this, which sometimes can feel, away from the world, but there's a way that the students are engaging with the world in ways that are really meaningful for thinking about the applications and implications of the discussions that we have and the assignments that we give them. So holding on to that piece.
And metaphor totally intended. You're planting the seeds.
Yes.
We're all planting the seeds. I've been making eye contact with you this whole time because the reason why I'm at this panel today is because of an applied project with Professor Constantine. And so myself as a grad student with 4 undergrads in tow, we had never been to St. Louis before, came down to help a team of housing justice lawyers, earth scientists, historians, public health people who were working with a town in East St. Louis called Centerville, Illinois. And this was an all-black community, primarily over the age of 60 or so, who had been living in basically raw sewage since even as far back as the 80s, due to, I want to say, city neglect, which was, we don't even know if it was a city, kind of the era of company towns and unincorporated towns, private, public, infrastructure, kind of neglect and or maldoing. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, flood control, selective flood control engineering projects, and basically for decades. And a team of us kind of came in to figure out what was going on. And I came in as a burgeoning historian, perhaps, with young people. And we went into archives all over St. Louis. We went into little, like the Carroll County Historical Society, and started pulling up these documents about showing, correspondence back and forth about how much something would cost when something was embezzled. This plan that was supposed to help these residents, and it just never materialized, right? So in a way, I think we try to not say this, but I will, of kind of finding smoking guns in the archive that then became part of this case, that then we confirmed with water and soil sampling, interviews with the residents, and now, from what I just heard, there's a huge settlement going on, and the last event that I had been to, the Tammy Duckworth committed $13 million. And so in that way, that is definitely an application. It's definitely a conversation about reparations, because money, that's just one kind of a down payment. But to show how 18-year-olds in a tiny archive in Illinois just helped get $13 million of reparations. So I'm proud of them.
Yeah, I want to apply for that too, actually. Like,
No,
amazing work.
Shout out to them, yeah.
Shout out to Jose. Yeah. What is that? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll ask a question. I guess this is a two-part question. What kind of pedagogies are meaningful within your work, and what does it mean to teach on possessed land?
I just want to note that we didn't read Williams's land acknowledgement when we started this panel, which I think perhaps was an oversight. So yeah, so in general, I both include it on my syllabi, but at a lot of events on campus, there's the land acknowledgement. But I know that Allison, Professor Guest, has been doing quite a bit of work with local indigenous communities, and I love the way that you sort of incorporate that into your pedagogy, so I actually just wanted to pass the question to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're all on possessed lands, right? The question is like, how is it possessed and who possesses it? And then to think further about possession in and of itself, you know. I often like to think about it not as just like the idea of property, but to also think about it as like a spiritual possession as well, like a continual haunting, right? And so for me, I came to Williams, like I didn't really know much about this place. I didn't really know much about Williams when I came here. I did all of my interview process via Zoom, so I accepted the offer to come here, and I hadn't ever visited. I hadn't seen the place. So for me, I kind of wanted to think more about myself in relationship to Black workers who had been here before me, so to think about myself as a new descendant of Black workers. And that ultimately led me to think about the history of this place and this institution. So I've been thinking a lot about what it means to think through dispossession from that vantage point, right? I wanted to know about the history of the names of people on these buildings. I mean, like, we're in Griffin Hall. Like, we should also like mention the fact that there was an incident that happened here that many students, you know, really felt, that faculty really felt. It was very offensive to Black and Brown and Native faculty and students and staff who work here. So I think it's important that we also address that as well, right? Because that is an act of possession on this land, right? That's a possessive act, right? To deface a statue, hang a Confederate flag, and then write rebel, like, that's important for us also, I think, to bring in this room, because we're in this building today. Yeah, I think there's so much more that could be said. I don't want to get like too, political about it, but I think it's important for us to think about like where we fall into this line of descendancy in this place. That's led me to think more about historic Black communities in this place, such as the White Oaks community. Bilal Ansari has done a lot of work thinking through, and really is like the walking archive of a lot of the stories that have been maintained about that community. And so, yeah, I think, what does it mean to teach on possessed lands? I think it means that we have a responsibility to think about these lineages, right? I think it's our responsibility to uncover institutional histories, right? I think that should be normalized, right? And I think it goes beyond just a land acknowledgement, because oftentimes that can just end up becoming a performance in which it's like a box that's checked, right? But what kind of meaning and power comes through that action, I think, is another question that we have to ask. And how are we living? We also have to think about our relationality to place and to one another. What are our obligations? What are institutions' obligations, right? So for me, that's what it's really meant. It's been a process of really trying to uncover.
And I think teaching can be such a valuable vehicle for the kinds of questioning, but also encouraging students to ask their own questions. So in my Intro to Environmental Studies class this semester, we read a number of different texts, including texts from Indigenous writers. And one of the students in the class sort of asked, like, well, why isn't the full history of this place that we now call the United States actually told, right? And we had a class conversation about what that would mean. And I think some of the answers and some of the sort of assumptions and sort of answers that we came up with was just that in some ways the sort of loss is incalculable, right? If you actually had to sit with the kind of depth of something like genocide, it would really shake the foundations that so many of our lives are built from. And I think it's just, intellectually, cognitively difficult to even wrap your mind around the sort of scale of loss, whether it's a kind of cultural loss or a loss of languages or a loss of ways of engaging with the environment that are not about extraction, which is incredibly important for us sort of thinking about this sort of climate change present. But there's a way that sort of the accounting process that can come from just being exposed to a number of different kinds of writers and texts, I think can start students on a trajectory that they make their own. I think sort of to the point about pedagogy, I always joke that as a professor, my job is not to sort of tell the students what to think, and I don't stage that as a kind of moral sort of thing, but actually as a practical and pragmatic one, right? I could sort of just dictate to the students the ideas that I would like them to have, but that's not learning, right? The ways that people learn new things, the ways that people internalize ideas in a way that might make them want to take different action in the world is that they have to grapple with it themselves, right? They have to be exposed to a range of different things and come to their own conclusions and then decide what they want to do based on that knowledge. So I think there's also a kind of humility that comes from attempting to even have these conversations with students, knowing that we can't force anything on them, right? That they are each autonomous individuals who will have to decide ethically, politically, how they want to live in this world, right? And we can't sort of do that for them, but we can sort of open the door to certain kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think also along the line of opening the door, I've been really, adverse in my work to talk about loss. When I say black land, people are always like, oh, 40 acres and a mule, when are we gonna get some land? And I'm like, well, it's not really, our land to get in the first place. But one of the questions that I've been meditating on in my work is what do we gain through the blight of dispossession, right? Because it's not all about loss. It's also, whenever there's loss or crisis, is also an opportunity. And I think it's about shifting from victimhood to being a victor in some way, right? Because loss indicates that we've lost. We've lost the race or we've lost the competition. And so if we're already starting from that place, I think that it means that we also have to reframe that question and think about what we gain. So that's kind of what it makes me think about also when I think about repossession.
And I think there's a certain amount of teaching and instruction my students give me. And so particularly in Kentucky, there's always a discussion about mining. I don't know anything about, I know very little about mining, but I do know that most, if not all of us in this room benefit from mining in some way, whether or not we philosophically disagree with it, we probably benefit materially from mining. And so generally I ask my students, because I teach a race, food, and environment class, and we have, at the end, we don't have a final exam, but we have a discussion where they do more work than they think they do, but it's a way for them to engage with the material that's not so stressful. And so one of the questions is always about like mining and politics and race. And one time we had this discussion in 2016, which was a really tense time to have this discussion in Kentucky. But I think it opened up a really interesting question about like how we understand extraction, how we understand living on stolen land, but also how we understand towns that are economically depressed but built around an entire economy that's based on mining. So for me, it's about learning and engaging with my students as much as possible, but also at times sliding in like questions of positionality, because they're like, what does positionality mean? I'm like, positionality means that me as a Black woman who's from the South in Kentucky has a very different experience than you might, but we can still have like an open and honest, open to an extent, an honest conversation about mining and extraction within the context of Kentucky. So it's been interesting and engaging, because we were talking about earlier, like what does it mean to teach at a public institution? So I get students from all parts of Kentucky, but it's been a learning process.
I'm just going to speak up because we're nearing the end, and you all might have questions of these four wonderful human beings. This would be a great time to hear them if you have some questions.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Second from the left, or the right, rather, with the white sweater.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned when you were, I think it was the first or second question response, you said there was some resistance to going into your field or your topic. And I was just wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more. What was that about, and whether it was a dissertation topic or the field itself, and then how did you work through it? I'm sorry, I think it was the one.
Yeah, I think it was mostly like attachment to what I thought that I would be doing previous to that. I think it was really grounded in just not wanting to let go like a particular vision of what I thought that the work would be, or that my work on this planet would be. I think it's oftentimes that in those moments, like, we're forced to have to like grow in ways that maybe we didn't anticipate, so you're not quite prepared for it, and you don't really have the full path fleshed out for you. So that for me was kind of like the resistance. And also, I guess as far as like the work, you know, what became my dissertation, like I just thought that I wouldn't be working in that particular geographic context again. I loved it, don't get me wrong, it wasn't any aversion by any means, but I think I wanted to focus more on thinking through Black people's relationships to land, something that was a little closer to home for me. But inevitably, when you think about the African diaspora as a region itself, you know, it's all close to home, and it all is home, right? So I guess for me, it took some time for me to learn and to really develop and strengthen that muscle and stretch it. So, yeah.
The bells will be ringing probably for the next half an hour, so we'll try to push it up. But time for a couple questions, and then we'll take our guests. I think I saw a hand in the back.
I just raised my hand because I really appreciate your sharing of your experiences to where you got here now in your teaching work and your styles. But I did see this was billed as geographies and colonialism, rebellion, food sovereignty, literacy, and African diaspora, and global environmental futures. And so I know it's really short on time, but if there were favorite classes that you teach or something on the topics, just so I have more of an idea of what you're actually teaching, that would be really wonderful.
Yeah, we can run down the, so here at Williams, I teach a global sustainable development class, which is about sort of global poverty and thinking through sustainable futures via institutions like the UN. I teach the Intro to Environmental Studies class called Nature and Society. I also teach a class called Africa and the Anthropocene, which is really thinking about climate change from the vantage of the African continent as the continent least responsible but most impacted by climate change. And then I am sometimes teaching a class called Science and Militarism in the Contemporary World. And the punchline there is that we know what we know about climate change in part because the US Department of Defense spent a lot of money, poured a lot of money into environmental science after World War II. So what does it mean to sort of grapple with that legacy and how we think about environmental science? So those are my classes.
What's the name of that course?
Science and Militarism in the Contemporary World. Is this question for all of you? Yeah, I would like to hear what you.
Oh,
well, yeah.
Okay.
Even though it's not here, but like
it's not here, but yeah. Teaching intro, and I teach a course right now I'm so excited about called Free the Land: Histories of Environmental Racism, and that's kind of looking at the idea of kind of weaponizing the earth and resources against people of color for thousands and thousands of years, and how that reframes the idea of what we call environmental racism and the ideas of Black and brown self-determination.
I'm teaching a course this semester. It's actually, I intended for it to be a year-long course, but we don't really organize classes that way here. So it's called Race, Land, and Settler Racial Capitalism, Ongoing Topics in Dis/Re/Possession. I teach also Intro to Africana Studies through Black geography, so it's pretty much to think about encountering Black geography or encountering Africana Studies through Black geography and through that lens. Next semester I'll be teaching a course called Rebel Ecologies, Black and Indigenous Struggles for Land and Life Against Extraction. And in the future, I also have a colleague that is at Wesleyan University, Zaire Simone, who wants to teach a course. We're thinking of co-teaching a course called Freedom is a Place, inspired by the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that will kind of trace out some of the various movements throughout the diaspora as it relates to liberation and freedom.
I teach, food, race, and environment, which is like a cross between ENS, so environmental studies, and geography, global environmental change, Black geographies at both the graduate level and undergraduate level. And they want me to teach an intro level course on anti-racism, but we're going to see about that. So that might happen. But those are in U.S. cities. Sorry, that's another one.
Well, if I could be an undergraduate again, I would sign up for every one of these classes without a doubt.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you.
What I wanted to say is that you all have spent this hour with us, sharing with us your histories, your stories, your past, your present. We're excited to see what the future has in store. And one of the things that I personally get from each and every one of you is this authenticity comes up. It's this desire to be true to yourself. And what a thing to be reminded of, all of us, whether we're students, whatever stage of life we're at. So I want to thank you all for sharing this hour with us. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.